So first, here's my thesis for this talk. What does it mean to create a world of love and compassion? I hope for and envision a world of cooperation, understanding, deep listening, and wholesome communication, not just between different people, but also between all forms of life and matter. I wish to treat others and see others treat each other with respect, equity, and kindness. I hope to see a time when those in need can lean on and count on the generosity and love of those more fortunate. We live in a culture of extreme individualism and egoic fragility. Petty grievances and goals rule the majority of our ambition. It is easy to care about only the security of our own being and those closest to us while leaving others defenseless. A weak ego, a weak reference point from which we can understand the world, fuels extreme individualism. But this egoic fragility is not the fault of any individual, but it has been caused due to a lack of development through systematic learning from a young age. We are taught to be in a constant mindset of depravity, and we are told that by amassing more material means we can gain a state of security and happiness. But there's never enough to be had. There's always more to be had, whether money or gizmos, decorations, or status symbols. This state of rampant individualism and egoic fragility keeps us from looking out for one another. It keeps us from caring about others and instead has our minds focused on the gains and achievements of the self above all else. So I propose that a deep exploration of personal consciousness and what exactly we mean when we refer to the self will, if done properly, create the conditions within our being to necessitate a shift from egoic fragility to egoic stability. Being content with one's own being will allow individuals to branch out and begin to care for others just as much or more than themselves. So the question is not, do we first promote the needs of individuals or the community? Instead, the ability to focus on one's own being builds a community where love, compassion, caring, and listening predominate. In the course of this presentation, I hope to share with you all some aspects and lessons I have learned about such a personal journey that hopefully inspire others to join me in generating more love and compassion in the wider community. Through this presentation, I will explore many topics, so please bear with me. If anyone has any questions at any point, whether online or in person, don't be afraid to ask them. I will do my best to answer them thoughtfully, and will also stop at intervals to see how we're all doing. Some topics I will explore include linguistics, semantics, and abstraction, the Hermetic and Jewish Kabbalah, theories of emotion, symbols and the rituals of ceremonial magic, the yoga of Patanjali, Buddhist yoga, and alchemy. All these topics are rich and profound enough on their own to afford each them a lengthy discourse on their meaning and value. What I aim to do here is acknowledge the context of each of these traditions that make them each beautiful expressions of understanding the world around us and our place in it, but also connecting them through common links that will illumine the value of spending time and energy investigating different traditions so as to find what is meaningful and inspirational to the individual that will act as a catalyst of personal transformation. So, forgive my artsy color coding of this. I hope this is readable for everyone. Just gonna pop them all up here. So first, let's get into the topic of language, linguistics, and abstraction. Linguistics is the systematic study of language and its structure. The particular subcategories of linguistics that I'll be focusing on is semantics. Semantics deal with how we attribute meaning to words in our abstraction of the world around us. Let's look at the symbolism sometimes attributed to water to better understand this. The qualities of water are like the mind. This simile shows us that our mind reflects the world around us, much like if you look into a pool of water, you will see a reflection of yourself. If an external force such as a breeze or a rock is thrown into this pool, it will ripple and the reflection will become distorted. Just as when our mind is anxious due to the world's problems, our perception of the world becomes distorted and inaccurate. Unfortunately, due to the nature of communication, you can welcome in whoever is here. Unfortunately, due to the nature of communication, it can be easy to spend most of our time in this reflection of the world. With words and descriptions, we start to build reference points and preferences about our environment. We construct a map of the imagination and language to understand the territory of our lives better. For example, the stylus that I am holding is not a stylus. Instead, the word stylus merely describes the object I'm holding, so it serves a purpose. If I were to ask someone to hand me this stylus if it were on a table, they would immediately know what I was talking about. However, if I were to ask them to hand me a spatula, and this was the only thing lying on the table, there might be some confusion. And so all powers are awakened and reawakened by names and images. This abstraction can help us navigate our reality. So it can be hard not to live in an abstract reality. When we do so, however, it is possible to lose our autonomy, as the influences of others can quickly shift our perception if we are not aware. Someone might say to us that we find a certain place to be scary. So when we go to that place ourselves, a preconceived notion of that place may influence how we experience it. This can be good or bad. Perhaps this place is dangerous, and so our friend telling us that it is scary causes us to be on our guard. Perhaps this place is full of extremely nice and helpful people, and your perception of it being scary makes us lose the opportunity to make connections with some incredible people. Now, what I am saying may not come as a surprise to anyone. I am laying the groundwork for further implications of this subject. Because most of the time we live in abstracted reality, we compare and understand the phenomenology of our experience with our thoughts. So we are living in an epistemological realm. Epistemology is the study of knowledge through thinking, as opposed to ontology, as the study of knowledge through being or direct experience. Okay. Slow down. Okay. As I have stated before, living in abstraction in the realm of epistemology creates a state that can be manipulated within us. What are we being manipulated by when we watch or read the news? Often, we are not consuming objective facts, but subjective opinions and value judgments of the person creating this news for you to consume. Brands and companies sell us products because we accept the notion through an advertisement that we are not complete without said product. Being bombarded by constant advertisements and news on television and the devices in our pockets has contributed to a society of collective fragility that constantly tries to fill a hole through external means rather than internal work. Not being able to see reality as it is, but only through the narrative that reflects it is dangerous. The constant narrative that runs our lives, nagging us to is too easily hijacked by others with influence. So now let's move into kind of a categorization almost. How's everyone doing? Online and in person? Good? All right, and this is contraction and expansion. So given our thesis, the way to see reality as it is and gain autonomy over our own being is to go in and observe the catalogs of our mind and experience. I have found categorizing our experience in two states of consciousness beneficial: contraction and expansion. The qualitative state of the contracted experience is marked by the abstract narrative that runs our lives. It is heavy and often weighs us down. It can create feelings of sadness and being lost. It's confusing and uncertain. This may be associated with anxiety, as the intellect considers every scenario to make sense of a situation. However, the expanded state lacks narrative that tells us who we are and what we need to do. This is an ontological state where we find being present. The qualities of freedom, possibility, and happiness mark it. There is true happiness and love in such a state, because this is not a state of there is no I, me, mine. A profound non-dual perception allows us to act spontaneously for the welfare of others in this uncontracted state of being. Coming into an expanded state is a practice, and as we continue our journey of being, it becomes easier to observe expanded states within ourselves. We have awareness. These states can begin to last longer and provide more insight into the nature of self and other, subject and object. Before I get too off track and into another side tangent that would be relevant, remember this: contracted and expanded states, categorization, while we explore our next subject. So here I actually want to jump to the next screen real quick, just to explore this concept of the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is a form of esoteric mystical Judaism that translates to received teachings. The origins of such teachings are found in the literature and practices of the Merkabah and Hekalah forms of Jewish mysticism. The Merkava teachings are based on the book of Ezekiel. And in his vision of the chariot, such teachings use meditative techniques to enact an algebraic transformation within the practitioner to bring exalted states of consciousness. The Hekkalot literature, however, deals with understanding how God created the universe, unraveling and further explaining in greater details the contents of the book of Genesis. So the Kabbalah, as we see it, comes about after the writing of the Zohar in 13th century Spain. It is the combination of understanding how God created the universe as well as a path of spiritual evolution. This is how we understand the Jewish Kabbalah. However, the Hermetic tradition adopted the Kabbalah and its practices during the Renaissance and much earlier. We can define the Hermetic tradition as the philosophy of Hermes Trismegistus, who is said to have written the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. When we look at the history of Hermeticism, it is likely the result of many great minds. We look at the history of many great minds from many traditions coming together in Alexandria, Egypt, around 2,000 years ago, synthesizing the practices of the Egyptian religion with the philosophies of Plato. And there's much more depth in explaining the origin of Hermeticism that I do not really have time to go into today. But what we see at this time, about 2,000 years ago, in the region of the Levant, being North Africa and the Middle East, is great influence going back and forth between Hermetic philosophy and Jewish mysticism. So in some ways, we can say that the Kabbalah has always been Hermetic. Some aspects of the Kabbalah that I would like to point out first are how it is explained that God created the universe. It is said that God created the universe with language, and indeed, this is known if we read Genesis, as it is stated that God spoke the words, "Let there be light." The imagery of this first part of the book of Genesis starts with dark water, and it is said that the Spirit of God hovers over the water. There's a lot to unpack here. The Hebrew word for spirit is ruach, and this ruach, this spirit, is the animating force behind the form of matter. We can think of this animating force as the breath, and we see when God breathed life into Adam. And if we examine the way we communicate, we will notice that speaking requires us to breathe. So the breath has an animating quality. And if we take this analogy of water being presented as consciousness, we will notice that God speaks or breathes over the waters of consciousness, creating ripples, creating form, creating the world out of language. Another way we can look at this is how others might try to persuade us. It seems to me that if someone wanted me to buy a car, it would be much more advantageous for this person to talk to me using a variance of tone and inflection that would affect me emotionally rather than simply handing me a piece of paper with the words "buy this car" written on it. With this example, hopefully we can see the difference breath makes in animating words and communication. And it seems I got a bit lazy. I didn't finish my script. So now I actually have to trust myself. I have to trust that I have the ability to finish this talk unscripted. So I actually want to go back. Let's actually look at this tree of life diagram a little bit. And we look at this, we see this in both Hermetic and Jewish Kabbalah. And it kind of represents this, a map of both our external universe, also our own personal psychology, and our own personal being. But we also see that it represents this creating force of the world by representing how energy gets more and more dense in each successive stages. So starting at this top, there's actually a lightning flash image. So it goes from one sphere over to the next. And this kind of represents the way that energy transforms and condenses into matter. But we can also see this on an inner psychological plane with how kind of different aspects of ourself kind of make the whole part of ourself. But let's go back to this part over here. This is contraction and expansion in the Kabbalah. So if we remember those ways we categorized states of consciousness being contracted or expanded, we can see in one of the spheres of the Kabbalah, it's actually that one over there, the top one on the left. That is the sphere of Bina. And this is a sphere that represents a lot of form. It represents form. And this is actually the waters of creation. She's known as the Great Mother. And as well as being associated with form, she's also associated with time, because time is one of those things that keeps us contracted. We have to follow things very linearly. You know, time is very important to living a regulated and stable life, right? We have to show up to our jobs on time. If we want to see that movie, we have to show up to the theaters on time when it starts. But in the in the Kabbalah, in the Hebrew Kabbalah, there is this concept known as the 50 gates of Bina. And in the 50 gates of Bina, it takes place over 50 days, and there's 50 of them because there are, in Hebraic Kabbalah, there are 5 worlds of the Kabbalah, and these worlds further explain how energy condenses into matter. And so it's 5 times 10, and so we get 50, and because there are 10 spheres on that tree of life. And so these are 50 days where we're actually going into the narratives we create about our suffering, the narratives that weigh us down. We're going further into these contracted states of our being, and through going into it and getting intimate with our own experience is actually how we can shed those off and let them go and come to a more expanded state of consciousness, one where narratives aren't so prevalent in our life. And so this going into these narratives, getting more intimate with them, allows us to kind of move away from the narrative eventually, leaning into more felt sense of being, our raw experience of feelings and emotions. And so again, with the tree of life, we can kind of see they're represented in the Hermetic Kabbalah 4 Kabbalistic worlds. And these are the worlds of Absolute, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asya. And so at the top, we kind of have the most subtle energy, and at the bottom, we have the most condensed form of matter. And these are color-coded like this because Asya and the physical is also associated with earth, which is associated with the color green. Yetzirah with air and yellow, Bria, emotion, and water, blue, Absolute, fire, and red. And so this being one of the ways that energy condenses into matter, we can see that as a map going in a downward motion, but we can also, through getting to know our own experience and how this happens within us, we can actually reverse that and go back up, getting from less dense into a more subtle state of consciousness, kind of into that more expanded state. So now let's kind of take a break from looking at the Kabbalah and kind of get into some theories of emotion that I think represent the greater points of this talk. And so I kind of want to talk about the theories of psychological constructionism, bottom-up and top-down processes, interpersonal and interpersonal relationships, and the difference between them and why it's important to cultivate both. So first, let's kind of look at bottom-up and top-down processes. So bottom-up processes are kind of where the external universe is affecting us, and it's affecting our state of being, and we're reacting to our world in that way. Whereas top-down processes we're more using higher functions like logic and reasoning and emotional intelligence to better respond to our world. So one of the ways I like to look at this is through the analogy of turning the other cheek and the New Testament that Jesus talks about. And I think this is an allegory that gets misunderstood a lot because it's not saying, that we should let people walk all over us. Rather, it's more looking at, in an allegorical way, our ability to respond to our world rather than react to it. But it's an allegory, so it's bypassing our normal intellect. It's actually getting to a more direct experiential aspect of reality that our intellect can't understand, that we really just have to experience. And this is one of the ways that kind of spiritual like riddles, like koans in the Zen tradition work, is that they're bypassing the intellectual mind to get you into a state of just being, of direct understanding. And so, instead of, when someone, say, like slaps you, usually the 3 responses are fight, or freeze. But that is usually because, we don't know what to do. We're reacting very quickly to everything that's happening around us. But we can actually work from a state of repose and respond to that and say, well, we can, interact with this person slapping us hypothetically, and try to reason with them, talk to them, say, hey man, I didn't like that hurt, I don't appreciate you, kind of try to work with people. that way. But yeah, I hope that kind of helps you guys understand this difference between bottom-up and top-down processes that we see in the field of psychology. Because we also deal with psychological constructionism. And this is the theory that emotions are created to fit the context of our situations, not that emotions actually just happen to us. Because when we look at, according to this theory of emotion, emotions are an interplay of intellect and feeling, and that we have our intellect and our thinking mind, our narratives, but we also have feelings that are working in us. And so, but it's this intellectual grasping on these feelings to explain them that creates a little bit more confusion. And this intellectual grasping on these feelings often perpetuates a negative feeling. And it's kind of this vicious cycle that becomes almost a snowball effect. But we can also use this theory of psychological constructionism in a positive way by working with forms and concepts to help us better understand how we're feeling, why we're feeling this way. But we can also use this to get away from those concepts once we understand them and dive more into the felt experience of being, where there's an unfolding, natural, groundless nature of reality and self. And so, like, for example, here, instead of saying we're angry, because angry, it's very general to say we're angry, right? We can be angry about a lot of things, but we can more precisely say to better understand how we're feeling, we could say, oh, I'm feeling righteous indignation, which is anger driven by contempt from perceiving something morally incorrect. And that can better help us understand how to handle the situation we're finding ourselves in. Next is, interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationships are those relationships we have with the people around us, our mothers, our fathers, our family, our friends, our teachers, everyone. But often, in an intrapersonal relationship is that relationship we have with ourselves, which often gets overlooked, and it's really important. A lot of times people focus on the interpersonal relationships and say, you just got to be nice to others, blah, blah, blah. But oftentimes being good to other people needs a strong and intimate intrapersonal relationship with the self and able to, in order to be conducive. Hi, welcome in. And take a seat wherever. And so, this interpersonal relationship that we cultivate with ourselves, we're really getting to know the contents of our own mind, the contents of our own experience. We're forming this intimate friendship with our own self. All those, oftentimes we don't want to acknowledge moments where we felt we made a mistake or where we were embarrassed, moments that feel cringy. We want to ignore that, but diving into it can actually help us better become more comfortable with ourselves. And as we become more comfortable with ourselves, I feel as though we can form a more authentic relationship with ourselves and then present a more authentic version of ourselves in our interpersonal relationships. And so I think it's really important that we get to know ourselves in that way to better help how we treat others. So now that we've looked at that, I kind of want to look at one of the ways that I find we can work with ourselves. And this is what's known as the Hegelian dialectic. And who Hegel was, not important. His philosophy, not super important. But this Hegelian dialectic is kind of seeing, we have this thesis, we have this conception of the world. And this concept of the world can often be concrete, but sometimes we meet with a conception of the world that doesn't, or we meet with an aspect of the world that doesn't gel too well with our conception. And so we kind of feel there's this paradoxical nature going on. How can something be this way and this way at the same time? So we have this thesis and we have an antithesis. And through working with that, we can actually find a balance between those two things and create a synthesis. But in creating that synthesis, we're creating a new concept of our world. And because we've created a new concept of the world, we have also a new antithesis. So it's something that's building on top of each other. So we're building concepts on top of concepts to create a better reference point to the world around us. And this can go in this way, but we can also do this in the opposite way of breaking through layers of reality, stripping away concepts to get to that more groundless state of being. And these things go hand in hand. So we see like that process of manifestation, like I talked about with the tree of life, it goes down, but we can also go up with it, which is something I actually forgot to talk about the tree of life, is one of the ways that we can kind of look at that, the way that manifestation comes into being with our own self is, we can look at, how our thoughts influence our actions, or say, we can really look, let me go back to those worlds again, actually. We can, say we have an inspiration, which is that spiritual world of absolute, that's our first realm of manifestation. And say we're playing Frisbee and the Frisbee goes up on the roof of our house. Say we have a house and a driveway. And so we're like, oh no, the Frisbee went up on top of the roof. How are we going to get that down? Well, should we build a concrete staircase on our driveway? No, that's impractical. Maybe we should build a ladder. So then we start to speculate, we start to think about how we're going to get that Frisbee down. And that happens in the world of Bria, the intellect. And so we start to formulate, we say, okay, well, let's get a ladder, or let's build a ladder. Say we're going to build a ladder. Say we like complex solutions to easy problems. So we want to build a ladder. And so how we're going to build that ladder and the blueprints of that ladder exist in the world of Yetzirah. What kind of wood are we going to use? What kind of screws are we going to use? Are we going to use a drill to screw those in? That exists in the world of Yetzirah. It's kind of this background blueprint of reality. And then in the physical world of Asya, that's where we actually build that ladder and go up onto our roof and get that Frisbee. And so, but we also kind of see that, again, that thesis, antithesis, and synthesis within those spheres of the tree of life. We see them going, kind of in this realm, and there's kind of these polarities, these opposites that then gel into a new synthesis. And then we keep going, and this process happens as manifesting reality or stripping away reality. But this can also work as we work on ourselves, and how are we going to treat others in a more equitable and compassionate manner. What do I need to do to take care of myself in order to be my best and authentic self, so that I can create a world of compassion and loving kindness, being kind to others, listening. So now I kind of want to get into this realm. There's these rituals of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Just very quickly, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they were a magical order that existed at the end of the 1800s and a little bit in the beginning of the 1900s. And we actually see remnants of their order still existing today in other orders. And that's a long history. I'm not really going to get into it, but what I want to focus in on are a couple rituals from this order that I think contextualize a little bit better what I'm trying to convey through this talk. But before I do that, I just want to check in on everyone. Is everyone doing okay? Any questions? Andrew's good? Cool. Robert, yeah, what's up?
So I really enjoyed the example of like fetching the Frisbee from the top of the house.
Yeah.
And I was following you through like the spiritual to the intellectual and the physical, but I kind of like missed the emotional, like
the Yetzirah
component, like the selection of the components that comprise the ladder. How does that relate to the emotional world? I didn't really understand.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Kind of let me go back to that. It's kind of interesting. So kind of like what I was saying, I mean, another way to so with the the way that this wisdom tradition was transmitted from classical Jewish Kabbalah to Hermetic Kabbalah, and also how Hermetic Kabbalah influenced original Jewish Kabbalah when the Greek magical papyri and the Heklat literature and the Merkabah literature were all kind of circling in that region around at the same time. For some reason or another, in traditional Jewish Kabbalah, as it was written down in the Zohar, we have 5 Kabbalistic worlds, which makes more sense to me because there's usually 5 elements, and there are 5 elements in the Hermetic tradition. But there's usually the realm of Adam Kadmon, which is the highest. And this is a little, I'm just kind of trying to give context to your question. But and then there's Absolute, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asya. But there's this intellectual component to feelings that creates emotion that kind of precurses emotion, given the theory of psychological constructionism, if you're following. Okay. Yeah. Sorry if I'm not being very clear.
Oh, no.
Okay, cool.
It's taking some time to build the framework.
For sure.
Reflecting your framework.
It does do that. Yeah. There's a lot to like different spiritual traditions where a lot of it's like very intellectual at first, where you're kind of building your reference point to it, and then you are able to kind of just like get into it once you have the kind of map constructed in your mind. But the Yetzirah plane is kind of almost like a duplicated. Are you familiar with like the term etheric? Like the ether, like etheric, or like so it's a duplicated it's a duplication of the physical, but it's less dense than the physical.
Right.
So so in the analogy of getting the frisbee off the roof, so that would be the blueprint of making the ladder, essentially. So it's like we know what the ladder is going to look like. We have the dimensions of the ladder. We have all the components, but it's not a physical ladder yet. It's kind of just a representation, an abstract representation of the ladder on the piece of paper.
Oh, so the intellectual is forming the representation. The representation is like kind of like it's like a mirror world.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, cool. All right. Yeah, sorry, I had a long explanation for this.
Oh no, that really tied together nicely.
Cool. I'm glad. Okay, so for when we look at these rituals of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, I kind of narrowed it down. There's a lot of them, but I narrowed it down to the pentagram ritual, the analysis of the key word, and the hexagram ritual. And the symbolism of this, I think, ties in very nicely to the rest of the talk. So when we look at the pentagram, it's a representation of the microcosm of our individual self. And as we think about ourselves as separate from the rest of the world, when really we're not, but that's kind of what this pentagram represents, is a smaller world of the self. And we see each of the points of the pentagram are neatly divided into those 5 elements. The top is spirits, water, air, earth, and fire. And so in this kind of ritual of the pentagram, it's the first ritual you learn when you're practicing the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, when you're practicing their style of magic. It's kind of a banishing ritual. So what you're doing is you're drawing pentagrams around you in 4 quarters, behind you, to both of your sides, and in front of you. But right now, I kind of just want to look at this idea of it being a relative individual self, more of a contracted state of consciousness, if you will, kind of loosely associated. And then so after you do that ritual, actually the next ritual you're supposed to do is the analysis of the key word. And so this is a really cool ritual. This is one of my favorites. It kind of starts by making this proclamation, INRI, which is the initials that were at the top of Jesus when he was crucified. And this stands for, traditionally, this stands for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The reason I add a question mark there is because alchemists of the Renaissance, they actually took these four letters and they had a different meaning for what they meant. In Latin, they had it mean igne natura renovatur integra. This means nature by fire is renewed in its integrity. Right? And so just quickly, what this ritual is doing is you're assuming these physical forms of the letters L, V, and X, and these also represent the Egyptian and Greek gods and goddesses of Isis, Apophis, and Osiris. But these have further, and these are also associated with astrological signs, Virgo, Scorpio, and Soul. And what they're kind of representing is, you have Isis, and it's associated with Virgo, and Virgo's the Virgin, and the Virgin, and it's representative of purity. But Isis is also, she's the mother, but she's an archetypal feminine energy, but she is the world as we know it currently. And then we have Apophis, and Apophis is a snake, and he's a destroyer. He destroys things. And he's, Scorpio, it kind of has that energy. Looking at you, Andrew. Scorpio. Has this destructive energy. That's one of the ways of looking at it that leads to it destroys the old to bring in something new. And that's what we see with Osiris, because Osiris is the resurrected god. He died and was resurrected. And that's one of the ways we can look at the symbolism behind the story of Jesus. Jesus is kind of a new version of the story of Osiris, the Egyptian god. But Jesus being crucified, this is kind of, and resurrected is kind of symbolic of the way that our conceptions about the world, or our consciousness and our present identifications that we hold in our mind, can die and then be reborn. And so what we're doing in this ritual is we're kind of taking these forms of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis almost. And we're drawing down the light that we saw on the Tree of Life. Representative of the top sphere is like this grand primordial energy of light that then condenses into matter. And in this ritual, we're drawing down light. After the pentagram ritual, we're drawing down light onto ourselves to enact a transmutation in our being. And so that's what that means. Nature by fire is renewed in its integrity. So fire, if we look at the tradition of alchemy, is a element that it enacts change in us. It boils water, which then turns into steam. And then oftentimes in alchemy, that steam is exposed to something cold and it condenses back into water. So it's a more pure form of its previous states. And so that's kind of what this ritual is getting at. So we have the pentagram ritual, then we have this purification going on, and then we get to the hexagram ritual. And this hexagram represents kind of our higher self, a self that is more responsive to the world rather than being reactive to the world, a world that has more influence on how, someone as an individual behaves, and then that also has more influence over the world in terms of being able to act with more intention and compassion and love and kindness. And again, we're doing this, we're drawing these hexagrams in front of us, behind us, and to our sides, just like we did with the pentagram ritual. And so, but that kind of completes that set of rituals. So we're going from kind of a reactive state to a purification, and then back into a more responsive state in the world. And this is all like really cool to talk about, but I think when you actually do this stuff, you actually notice it affecting you in ways that make it so that you are more aware of yourself. You can then act with more intention in the world. I hope that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions about those rituals? We're all good. Yeah.
Could you show that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, hey, okay.
Could you, you've done this before when you had everything. Could you show those 4 signs just with your body?
The LBX?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of, so we do L, B, X. And it actually begins with this position, which is representative of being sacrificed on a cross. And then there's Isis, Apophis, Osiris, the resurrected god. And then you are actually saying the initials of their names together, AAO, which is a whole nother thing. But then you're kind of invoking this light into your being to enact this transformational process. And then that's when you do the hexagram ritual, which, again, like I said, is the higher self. So that,
Yeah.
good, cool. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so now I kind of want to transition from looking at the rituals of the Golden Dawn to kind of more looking at the yogic tradition. I'm just going to take a drink of water before we do that. All right, so Om. We're all familiar with Om or Aum. So this is known as a bija sound from which all other sounds emanate. It's kind of, we may have heard this as a sound that necessitates the creation of the world. Because a lot of times in yoga, we see it explained that all of reality is just kind of a dance of vibrations. And so we can look at these 3 letters of Aum as we make them, and we look at the A as representing the Hindu god Brahman, the creator. Ooh, when we're saying Au as Vishnu, who kind of sustains that creation, and then in the silence as Shiva, which destroys creation and kind of necessitates a dissolution. But then there's also a transformation that happens because of this. And processes happen again. So in but if we look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, we can actually see yoga, yoga is sometimes, if we look at the actual word itself, it means union, kind of union with the divine. But the way Patanjali, I think, right, Andrew? Yeah, described it, is that it's Chitta Viditi Nirodha, which means the cessation of the turns of the mind. So kind of if we look at that, analogy of water again that we talked about before, both in terms of the creation of the world in Genesis and also as an analogy for how the mind reflects things. That's kind of what our intellect is doing. It's reflecting the world, and we're kind of going over narratives and stories in our head over and over again. And so this practice of yoga is kind of stilling that, is making this water that reflects the world less turbulent, but stilling this pool of water so that it reflects the world as like a one-to-one reflection. And so, in Patanjali, he brought up the klishas, which were, he said, were kind of, they're known as poisons. They translate to poison from Sanskrit, and they're kind of what perpetuate a sense of individually existing self that's separate from the world. So we have a video, which actually means ignorance. That's one of the ways we can translate it, but it's not seeing things as they are. It's more seeing things as we are, as conditioned by our likes and dislikes. And then we have raga, which is our attachment. And that is our attachment to those things, things like, being attached to things that kind of cover up that groundless nature of existence, that help us stay attached to that narrative of I. But we also have that aversion to things which also perpetuate our sense of self. And we have, which is the Vesa, and then we have Asmita, which is those narratives that are of I, that are separate from the world. And then Abhinavesa, which is the thirst for further existence or the fear of death, and that kind of goes back into that attachment to the narratives of who we are. And, looking at that analogy of water, when we still the water and we reflect the world, we just see things as they are. We stop inserting our own narratives into things. Let's see, what's this next one? Oh yeah, prana. So when we practice yoga, we're dealing with prana and apana. And in classical yoga, prana and apana, I think prana is the in-breath. Is that right, Andrew? Or in the in-breath and out-breath, prana and apana. Yeah, but then in Tantra, we actually see that reversed. In Tantra, it's actually where this comes from. And so we see prana, I think, as the out-breath instead, and apana as the in-breath. Or maybe that's the other way around. I'm kind of unclear about that, but that's not really the point. But prana is kind of like what we were talking about. It's similar. It's not the same. It's very similar to kind of the animating force that we looked at in Kabbalah. It's that force that drives things. And it's very closely tied to our thoughts. And so when we look at that definition of chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of the turnings of the mind, if we look at that word chitta, that means mental activity. And mental activity to yogic practitioners or to Buddhists who also practice yoga, the mind isn't simply an intellectual thing, it's also the heart. It's tied to feelings. The mind is seen as our experience. So when we're practicing, say, pranayama, or we're just meditating and sitting, we can notice that the prana, as our breathing gets like fast and heavy, you might notice that it's tied to our thoughts being very turbulent. And so as we kind of slow the breath, our thoughts can also turn, because this prana that animates our thoughts, we can kind of think of the thoughts as forms, that the prana is kind of this force behind the forms that kind of fuels it like a car, I think I said here. And so it's kind of elongating the breath, going more into our felt sense of the world, that allows kind of the cessation of the turnings of the mind, or the mind to actually calm down, that allows for that more clear reflection in the pool of water. And there's an analogy that in yoga, they talk about that the universe, I think they say the universe is a day to Brahman, and that, yeah. Oh, Mo has a question. Yeah, was that a question or a comment?
Question mark. So I don't know, not quite exactly sure. Mo about the
Oh, that's okay.
What-
So
The
can you,
question is that maybe a representative excessive amount of thoughts?
yeah, well, I think that, kind of like what we were talking about before, I mentioned the snowball effect, how, our thoughts often latch onto our feelings, and that's where emotion is generated because we're trying to explain our feelings. But when we're explaining, sometimes when we explain our feelings, we're drawing narratives about what happened to us, and that can make us more angry or more upset because that feeling is kind of getting reenacted, and then we're latching onto that again with intellect, and there's this snowball effect that kind of brings about a panic attack. Perhaps that is what the getting at the essence of that question. But so in yoga and in Hinduism, it's said that Brahma, on, I think it's on the, when he breathes, he's creating the world. And when, in between those breaths, like when we breathe in, there's a slight pause. And then on the exhale, it's a slight pause. So maybe, I think that, one of those sayings that on the inhale, there's a creation of the world that Brahma is creating. And then on the exhale, it's kind of this dissolution of the world. And then kind of in those spaces in between, there's a pause, but then there's another inhalation and another exhalation that are creating these worlds. And I think what they're trying to get at by saying that Brahman is creating the world as he breathes is we're kind of looking at this aspect of how prana, which is tied to our breath, kind of fuels our thoughts that create conceptions about the world. And that by lengthening the breath through, I'm forgetting the yogic name of this pranayama technique, which is a form of breath control, but oftentimes it's known as the fourfold breath or box breathing, where you breathe into the count of 4, hold it for the count of 4, exhale to the count of 4, and hold it again for the count of 4. We can kind of practice noticing how our breath is connected to our thoughts and how our thoughts are creating conceptions about the world, and how in these moments between our breath, there's this pause between thoughts. There's this gap between thoughts. And we can slowly learn to reside in those gaps more and more. And even maybe in those gaps, we can start to influence our next thoughts to create conceptions about the world. Yes.
Just prana is you were trying to in and out.
Right.
But that's more to do with linear psychic energy moving up.
Yeah, I'm getting there. Yeah.
Okay.
But also, they're switched in like classical yoga and tantra. They're opposites. I forget exactly which one is which. So now I kind of want to look at, in yoga, what we describe as the nadis and the samskaras. The nadis are kind of these pathways of pranic energy. But what's connected to these nadis is our patterns of thought, which, as we've seen, our thoughts are the forms that the breath fuels. And these samskaras are kind of just meshes of these nadis that necessitate patterns and impressions of self and who we think of ourselves to be. They kind of inhabit this realm of concepts of who we are. But they're influenced from past actions, which is sometimes known as karma. And which is also why one of the reasons that in a lot of, in yoga and Buddhism, we see a code of ethical conducts kind of as the first stage, because we're trying to purify the mind. We're trying to create these conceptions about the world that are healthier so that we can better break those conceptions. And so, there are these kind of webs of intermingling nadis that have the prana flowing through them that also are connected with our thoughts about the world and our conceptions, which is actually really similar to neuroscience. We see in the brain, we see different neurons connected together. And these different neurons are connected, and they're pathways. A neuron connects to it sends signals away from one neuron via axons, and then dendrites pick up that signal and bring it to another neuron. And these neurons that connect, they kind of create this interweaving mesh that make up our muscle memory, our memories themselves, our personality, our behavior, a lot of those conditioned ways. And the way that we strengthen those connections in our brain is through repeatedly doing things, by forming that muscle memory, by forming habits. And so like if someone is affected like by a brain injury, those can be sheared, and we can lose memories or we can lose motor functions. But we also have the ability to reconnect those pathways similarly, and yes, similarly to the way some scars are enmeshed that kind of operate in a similar way. Do you have a question? Oh no, okay. Cool. All right, so now I kind of want to get into this concept of Kundalini, which comes from Tantra. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this in the West and in like modern days, because this concept of Kundalini, it comes from Tantra, which existed. The first tantras were actually scripts. They were scripture that meant like received teaching from the gods. But there's different ways to like translate those two syllables, tun and tra. But there were these bodies of teachings, more so on, and they were kind of divided. There was like a more orthodox way of viewing these teachings that was dualistic, but there was also this more non-dual aspect of approaching these teachings that I kind of want to focus on. That was known as the Kaula Tantra, and this Tantra was more associated with like goddess worship, and it didn't involve so much orthodox, like ritualistic practice to attain a state of divinity, but it was more of having a relationship with a guru that brought you through a journey to, but you had to be initiated into a tantric sect. But anyway, so this Kundalini is this energy that kind of is found at the root chakra. If we're familiar with the chakras, we have, commonly we have 7 of them. And this idea of there being 7 a lot of times comes from Sir John Woodruff, who was a theosophist that translated, I think, a medieval text, and that kind of, and then the theosophists took hold of it and really explored this concept of there being 7. But in different forms of Tantra, there were sometimes 5 or 3 chakras. And these chakras are kind of these meeting points of the samskaras, these meshes of energy, these points of extreme self and identification and narratives. And so, but this energy of Kundalini, this is a feminine energy contained at the roots, and at the crown there is kind of there's Shiva, there's that all-encompassing consciousness. And so a lot of times what we conceive as Kundalini is that the Kundalini, as it rises, it gets to that crown. And kind of the more symbolic meaning behind this is that as it rises, it burns up the samskaras. It burns up these conceptions we have around ourselves. It burns up those to get to a more, like I said, groundless state of awareness. But in the Tantra, we also see that this energy goes down as well as up from the crown, where it enters in the Sasahara, what's that chakra called? The Sahasrara chakra, that head chakra, and it comes down, but it can also go up, and there's kind of this dual nature. Whereas a lot of times I think, when we talk about like Kundalini yoga in the West, we kind of just have this conception of it going up. But the idea is that it goes up through this central channel. And if you can see, there are these 3 nadis, which are these channels for pranic energy. And there's that middle one called the Sushumna pillar. And then there is the right one, which is associated with the sun, and it's Pingala. And then there is the left one, which is Ida, which is associated with the moon. And as those samskaras are burnt up, the conception of thinking of ourself as separate from the world is really a perspective of duality. But as we practice with this map of the chakras, with these central channel and these right and left channels of the sun and the moon, these channels, they actually converge into the central channel and become one channel. And that's kind of representative of this idea of opposites coming together, of opposites, not of the realm of duality, and we're more emerging into a perception of non-duality. Actually, I want to read a practice that I found that is really interesting, kind of explains this a little bit more. So this is known as the tantric dhyana, or meditative visualization. And it, so the first step is you center your awareness in the space of the heart, remembering that therein dwells the divine light that is the essential nature of all things. Then you visualize your body as a body of light, focusing your visualization vividly on the three primary subtle channels, nadis, breathing out the solar Pingala and breathing into the lunar Ida, and holding the breath in the central channel, Sushumna, until these three fuse in the heart center. Visualize the fused energy as a radiant light of the deity in the form of a 12-spoked wheel of fire, rising from the heart, flowing out of one of the sense apertures, like the eyes, nose, mouth, and coming to rest on an external object, actually present or imagined. As the fire wheel spins, resting on this object, contemplate that the object is created by consciousness alone, that consciousness alone maintains it, and that the consciousness dissolves it back into itself. After the object is dissolved into the fire wheel, withdraw it back into yourself, reposing in the dynamic stillness of the absolute ground of the whole process. The process repeats, except now the object is the subliminal impressions or samskaras of the prior object. And so I think this is a really interesting practice, because we're starting to work within a more intentional way concepts, or our ability to actually shape the world around us, to use our mind to breathe into forms, which I think the practice of doing something like that can better help us act with more intention in the world. And it's interesting because we kind of see the objects, we see, we're breathing in and we're imagining it going into the Pingala, the sun channel. This is representative of the sun, because the sun is seen as something that illuminates things. It shines a light on things so that we can better see it. And in tantric practice, the senses were seen more as something that, rather than passively receiving the world around us, there's something that more reached out to the world to grab it into us. And then we kind of see this other element with the moon. As we breathe out, it's the moon we know is reflective. So again, we see that reflective quality of consciousness, that consciousness, that our view of the world is often a reflection of it. It's not a one-to-one thing. But through this practice, we see that fusion of the two of opposites into a single. And I also wanted to read this other part that is from I think a Renaissance tantric yogi. He says, one who meditates thus repeatedly discovers that the cycles of creation, stasis, and dissolution are in terms of the highest reality, solely one's own consciousness, and thus discovers that the ultimate nature of one's own consciousness is its free and independent exercise of these powers. At the very moment of the full realization of this, he becomes God. So through repeated practice come all desired powers and attainments, as well as liberation. And this is that liberation from the constricted forms of consciousness into an expanded state of consciousness. And when he says that he becomes like God, that's not saying that I'm God in an egotistical sense. It's more acknowledging that I am a part of everything around me, and that I can intentionally create the world around me. And hopefully we create that world with love and kindness and compassion, per the title of this talk. So that's not the end. So now I want to get to this. Nothing is true. And everything is permitted. This is something that was said by Hassan Isabah. Hassan Isabah was the leader of the Nizari Ismailis, and they were a political faction in the Middle East that assassinated political opponents. And the word assassin is actually where we actually get that word from his organization, sometimes known as the Hashashins, but that was a little bit derogatory. There's a misconception about them that they smoked a lot of hash, and that was one of the ways that he controlled them. But that seems more to be the influence of writers trying to discredit this order by saying they're drug addicts. Anyways, the point of this is to say that nothing is true it's to get into this acknowledgement that there's this groundless, unfolding nature of our being, that our conceptions about the world are often not true reflections of the world, but they're distorted, right? And to dive into that groundless nature of the being, and saying that everything is permitted is to take responsibility. We have to take responsibility once we realize the groundless nature of being to then create concepts in the world that are more conducive to a kinder, more compassionate and loving world. To help others hopefully realize the groundless nature of existence. And this groundless nature of existence, saying that is to, I'm saying that things are impermanent essentially. That what is happening within us, it's constantly changing. That there is no solidly existing independent self. That what we take to be self is dependent on the world around us. That the world and ourself are interconnected. So that is nothing is true and everything is permitted. The groundless nature of reality, and then the responsibility we have to treat others with kindness. To help other people. And so there's one more quote I want to look at. And that is, in the intervals, become the conjurer of illusion. So this is a quote from yoga, a type of Buddhist yoga that is known as mind training. And this mind training is, it's a yoga because we're working with the contents of our own mind. We're working with the narratives in our mind, and we're consciously changing these narratives. And so this saying actually, in this practice of mind training, what we're doing is we're breathing in other people's suffering, and we're exhaling other people, and we're exhaling our own happiness and giving it to other people. And oftentimes after this practice or other mind training practices, we say a little aphorism like all dharmas are empty, kind of to reframe the practice, put it back in orientation. And that's what this is referring to traditionally, is that in those intervals between practice, we say those. But what I actually got from this, the insight that I got from this saying, in the intervals become the conjurer of illusions, is that within those spaces of our narratives, in those gaps between our thoughts, when we reside in those gaps, we can then form new thoughts and concepts in a more intentional manner. And like I've said before, hopefully those new concepts and thoughts are conducive to loving kindness, compassion, and a kind world. And I actually, while contemplating this and contemplating the Hermetic tree of life, I had somewhat of a vision, and I call it a vision because I didn't systematically think about it. It kind of just like came to me, and I was like, oh my God, I have to draw this. So what I drew is this. I don't know if everyone can see that okay, but what we're dealing with is just what I described. It's in the intervals become the conjurer of illusions. What we have here is an alchemical apparatus known as an alembic, and that's holding water. And again, water, like I've stated before, is representative of consciousness. And if we're able to get into a deep interpersonal relationship with ourselves, to dive into the seat of the self, which in many traditions is the heart, we can get in touch with our own tender heart. That place where we can connect with ourselves and others. And we can kind of use that as a fire to boil the waters of consciousness. And from those waters, work with that steam to condense it back into water, which then turns into the forms in the world around us. And those forms are represented by the Platonic solids you see at the bottom there, the cube, the sphere, and the pyramid. So I thank everyone for listening to me.